Hey guys, 6.4, rhombuses, rectangles, and squares. Okay, kind of like what we were doing with parallelograms today in class. So what we want to talk about is a rhombi. What will it have? In order to be a rhombi, it needs opposite sides that are congruent. It also needs opposite sides that are parallel. It needs opposite angles that are congruent, and diagonals that bisect each other. And lastly, it needs consecutive angles that are supplementary. If you notice, these are all properties of a parallelogram. A rhombi will have all of the properties of a parallelogram. What it will have in addition is all sides that are congruent. All of the sides will be congruent. Diagonals that are perpendicular to each other, meaning there'll be 90-degree angles that are formed, and diagonals that bisect a pair of opposite angles. So these two properties that make a parallelogram are rhombus. Okay? Or these three, sorry, not these two. These all make a parallelogram a rhombus. You take a parallelogram and you add on that all sides are congruent, the diagonals are perpendicular to each other, and the diagonals also bisect a pair of opposite angles. So, it's important to know that a rhombus is a quadrilateral, right, 4 sides, and a parallelogram. So that's rhombi. The next one we're going to talk about is a rectangle. If I can find it on the screen. Kind of a mess right now. A rectangle is a type of quadrilateral. Here's a rectangle right here. Rectangles will have opposite sides that are congruent. Right, AB is congruent to DC. Opposite sides that are parallel. Opposite angles that are congruent. Consecutive angles that are supplementary. Diagonals that bisect each other. And again, remember, these right here are all properties of a parallelogram. And then down here, all angles that are right angles and diagonals that are congruent. Okay, this is what makes it a rectangle. Makes the figure a rectangle. So it has all the properties of a parallelogram, and then it has all angles that are right angles and diagonals that are congruent. So a rectangle is a quadrilateral and a parallelogram. That is a rectangle. This is my figure above that I went ahead and marked up if you'd like to copy that down. I know the colors don't show up that well, so that makes it a little tricky. And the rest of the page down here. Okay, let's talk about squares. Squares are super special. All squares will have, let me get centered here, the properties of a parallelogram. So, opposite sides that are congruent, opposite sides that are parallel, opposite angles that are congruent, diagonals that bisect each other, consecutive angles that are supplementary, properties of a parallelogram, right? All of those. It will also have the properties of a rectangle. All the angles are right angles, and the diagonals are congruent. So it has the properties of a rectangle too. And then it will also have all the properties of a rhombi. So all the sides are congruent. The diagonals are perpendicular, and diagonals bisect a pair of opposite angles. So, a square is a quadrilateral, a parallelogram, a rectangle, and a rhombus. So hopefully by now we're understanding all the properties of a parallelogram, these 5 properties. We're tying in the properties of a rectangle, which we learned about a minute ago, as well as the properties of a rhombi, which we learned back a few minutes ago. And those are your notes for tonight. All right, guys, see you later.